Think about the fall of a great empire, and a clean picture comes to your mind. A signature on a document, a royal carriage driving away, a flag coming down on a tidy, sad note. That's the image most history books love, but the truth is messier. The fall of an empire is rarely tidy. It is loud. It drags on for years, sometimes decades, and the people who live through it spend the rest of their lives dealing with what was left behind. Nowhere is this messier than in the story of Napoleon's family after Waterloo. So let me set the scene. June 18, 1815, a few miles south of Brussels, on a wet patch of Belgian farmland, Napoleon Bonaparte lost his last battle. The Emperor of the French, who had crowned himself 6 years earlier at Notre Dame, was now a beaten man. The coalition armies of Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia closed in. By nightfall, his imperial guard had broken, and so had his dream. Now here's the part most people skip. Napoleon wasn't alone in this story. He had 4 brothers, 3 sisters, a wife, an ex-wife, a son. Dozens of nieces, nephews, in-laws, and cousins through marriage. Almost all of them held a throne. Almost all of them lost it. And what happened next is one of the most chaotic family sagas in modern history. Let me take you back to where the real unraveling begins. Paris, March 1814. The coalition had marched into France from every direction. Napoleon had lost in Russia in 1812, lost at Leipzig in 1813. He was down to a few 100,000 tired soldiers defending a country tired of him. His marshals were whispering. His Senate was plotting. The old Bourbons, the family he had kicked out more than a decade earlier, were being floated as a compromise solution by the Allies meeting in Paris. So Napoleon did what Napoleon did. He tried to control the narrative. He stepped down. He signed the Act of Abdication at Fontainebleau on April 6, 1814. He gave up the throne of France. He gave up the throne of Italy. He gave up everything. In exchange, the Allies handed him a small Mediterranean island called Elba, full sovereignty over it, a personal guard of about 400 men, and an annual income of 2 million francs paid by France itself. Imagine that. The man who had ruled most of continental Europe was now in charge of a tiny island roughly 90 miles off the Tuscan coast, with about 12,000 residents, a few fishing villages, and a fortress town called Portoferraio sitting on its northern coast. He arrived on April 30th, 1814, in a French frigate called the Undaunted. But here's what most people don't realize. Napoleon didn't sit around on Elba feeling sorry for himself. He turned himself into a one-man development agency. He reorganized the agriculture, opened new roads, built a small theater, improved the harbor, inspected troops every morning on the ramparts of his little palace. He even studied English grammar, in case he ever needed it. The household he brought with him was itself a small, weird, imperial ghost. His mother, Letizia, who by this time deeply disliked her son. His sister Pauline, who brought a small entourage of lovers and servants. Elba started to look less like an exile and more like a strange little Mediterranean kingdom, played out by a man who could not stop being Napoleon, even when he had nothing left to be Napoleon over. It worried the powers at the Congress of Vienna, because on the evening of February 26, 1815, Napoleon slipped away from Elba. He boarded a small brig called the Inconstant, picked up about 700 of his loyal guards from a beach on the mainland, and sailed back toward France. The 100 days had begun. This next chapter moves fast, almost too fast to keep up with. Napoleon landed near Cannes on March 1, 1815. He had no army. He had no weapons. He had the look of a man betting everything on a single moment of theater. He walked straight into a French regiment sent by the restored Bourbon King Louis XIII to stop him. And instead of arresting him, the regiment walked over and joined him. They cheered him. The next regiment did the same. Within 2 weeks, he was back in Paris, again in charge of France. Louis the Quiets fled. The Bourbons, who had just spent a year getting comfortable, were out again. By early June, Napoleon had raised a new army of about 280,000 men. He wanted to strike before the coalition could fully reorganize. He crossed into Belgium in mid-June, hoping to defeat the British and Prussians separately before they joined forces. On June 16, 1815, he fought the Battle of Ligny against the Prussians and won. On June 18th, he fought Waterloo against the Duke of Wellington, supported by the Prussians under Field Marshal Blücher, and lost, by total defeat. By evening, the Imperial Guard was retreating. By the next morning, the army was disintegrating. Napoleon fled the battlefield in his carriage. He ended up at Rochefort on the French Atlantic coast, hoping to escape to the United States. The British were waiting. They had the Royal Navy in the harbor. So on July 15, 1815, Napoleon surrendered himself to the British captain Frederick Maitland on the HMS Bellerophon, anchored in the harbor. He was 21 days past his 46th birthday. He was a defeated emperor. The Allies still had to decide what to do with him now that they had him. The fear was simple. If they let Napoleon wander free, he might do this again. He had done it twice already. 3 times would be unthinkable. They needed a place that was genuinely impossible to escape from. They needed him far enough away that no sympathetic French crowd could come running to him. They picked Saint Helena, a tiny, rocky British island in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, about 1,200 miles west of the African coast. On October 15, 1815, Napoleon stepped onto Saint Helena aboard HMS Northumberland. He would never leave it. Saint Helena was a miserable place, and the more miserable it got, the more Napoleon's legend began to grow. He arrived in October 1815 and never stopped writing. He dictated his memoirs to a small staff of loyalists who had followed him into exile. He fought with the British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, almost continuously. He renamed rooms of his rented country house, Longwood, after his old imperial palaces. He let his hair grow long in imitation of the Roman emperors. His health, never great, deteriorated sharply. For nearly 6 years he lived in this strange, humid, cramped exile. He died on May 5, 1821. He was 51 years old. The official cause was stomach cancer, though modern historians have argued, perhaps persuasively, that it may have been arsenic poisoning from the wallpaper in Longwood House. Either way, the cause became its own controversy, and it still is. Now this is something most people skip past. After Napoleon died, the British did not return his body to France. They buried him on Saint Helena, in a small spring in a valley called Seine Valley, under a plain stone. 2 wooden boards, one reading Bonaparte and the other Napoleon, lay on top. For nearly 20 years, that was how things stayed. Then, in 1840, King Louis-Philippe of France, who himself was a fragile compromise between the old Bourbon family and the new France emerging in the 19th century, made a decision that would change the political mood of the country. He asked the British to let him bring Napoleon's remains home. They agreed. A French prince sailed to Saint Helena with a small flotilla. They opened the grave on October 15, 1840. Napoleon's body, remarkably, had survived. It was placed in a coffin. Then, in one of the most theatrically staged events in 19th century European history, it was carried back to France aboard the frigate Belle Poule. The ship crossed the Atlantic and sailed up the Seine River to Paris. Wherever it went, crowds lined the riverbanks. When it reached Paris on December 15, 1840, hundreds of thousands of people turned out, despite freezing weather, to watch the procession. The coffin was carried to Les Invalides. Years later, in 1861, during the reign of Napoleon's nephew, Napoleon III, the body was moved to its final resting place, the great circular crypt under the golden dome of Les Invalides, where it lies today. The coffin sits inside a series of nested sarcophagi of red quartzite. Millions of people come every year to walk in circles around it. Now we have to talk about the son, because the son, more than anyone in the family, became the symbol of what was lost. His name was Napoleon Francis Joseph Charles. He was born on March 20, 1811, in the Tuileries Palace, while his father was at the height of his power. Because his mother was Marie Louise of Austria, the daughter of Emperor Francis I, the boy was, from birth, technically a European superstar. Every court in Europe tracked his first words. His father nicknamed him L'Aiglon, the Little Eagle, and gave him the official title, the King of Rome. That was a tradition in the Holy Roman Empire. Whoever was born as heir to the imperial throne got that title. Napoleon had just revived the title for his own son. But by the time the boy was 3, his father had lost everything. Marie Louise had been sent home to Vienna by the Austrian emperor, who was her father, when Napoleon fell the first time in 1814. The boy stayed behind in Paris briefly like a hostage of the new Bourbon regime, then was taken to Vienna in 1814, where his grandfather raised him as a member of the Habsburg family. They changed his name. They gave him the German version. They called him Franz. They gave him a new title, Duke of Reichstadt. They made sure he never forgot, in any situation, that his father had been the man who had invaded their lands, humiliated their armies, and forced them to marry into the family. So the boy grew up essentially a prisoner of his own name. He was the son of Napoleon in the household of the Habsburgs. He was, in some quiet sense, a hostage. He wanted throughout his entire short life to be allowed to go back to France, to know his father. The Austrians refused. They never let him set foot outside of Habsburg territory. Napoleon himself, exiled on Saint Helena, knew he had a son in Vienna. The two of them wrote letters back and forth, but the letters were filtered by the Habsburg government. They were often delayed. Some of them never got through. The boy king of Rome never got to see his father again. Napoleon died on Saint Helena in 1821, and the boy, still in Vienna, was reportedly deeply shaken. He was 19. From then on, his health began to fail. He was consumptive. He coughed blood. On July 22, 1832, at the age of 21, Napoleon Francis Joseph Charles, Duke of Reichstadt, the little king of Rome, the only legitimate son of the great emperor, died in Vienna. He was buried in the Habsburg imperial crypt, the Kapuzinergruft, in the same vault as dozens of Habsburg emperors, kings, queens, and archduchesses. The emperor's body lies in Paris, under the golden dome of Les Invalides. The emperor's son lies in Vienna, inside a dark stone sarcophagus. They are separated by about 700 miles of European geography. They will never be reunited. Let me take you through the brothers. Because the brothers really did hold thrones, plural. Napoleon came from a Corsican family of modest means. By 1815, he had elevated at least 4 of his brothers to ruling monarchs, mostly through conquest or through strategic royal marriages. 5 thrones on heads that had never held anything before. Joseph Bonaparte, the eldest, became King of Naples in 1806. He was, by all accounts, a decent, bookish, well-meaning man who happened to be the wrong person for the job. He was later moved to become King of Spain in 1808 after Napoleon forced the Spanish Bourbons out, and that is where things got really complicated. He ruled Spain for 5 years through a brutal and unsuccessful guerrilla war. The Spanish fought back hard. He lost. He fled in 1813 and went into exile in the United States. He bought a large estate in Bordentown, New Jersey, called Point Breeze, where he lived in a strange, lavish, scaled-down imitation of imperial court life, surrounded by paintings, servants, and gardens, until he ran out of money and ended up back in Europe. He died in Florence in 1844. Louis Bonaparte, the second brother, became King of Holland in 1806. Louis tried his best to be a real Dutch king. He learned Dutch. He tried to defend Dutch national interests against his brother, which infuriated Napoleon. Louis famously refused to drain Dutch troops into the Grande Armée for the Russian campaign, and Napoleon publicly humiliated him for it, even stripping him of several Dutch provinces in 1810. Louis abdicated in 1810 in favor of his son and went into exile. He died in Florence in 1846. His son, however, the former Grand Duke of Berg, was to become one of the most important Bonapartes in 19th century history. We'll come back to him. Lucien Bonaparte was the smartest of the bunch. He had helped Napoleon pull off the coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799. Napoleon gave him the little title of Prince of Canino, a tiny place in the Papal States. Lucien wrote poetry. He died in Rome in 1840, 2 days after hearing about the return of his brother's remains. His grandson, Charles Lucien Bonaparte, became one of the great ornithologists of the 19th century. Jérôme Bonaparte, the youngest, had married an American woman from Baltimore named Elizabeth Patterson. Napoleon forced the marriage to be annulled because an American wife, however charming, was not in his European political calculations. Jérôme was then married off to a Württemberg princess and made King of Westphalia, a kingdom Napoleon carved out of German territory in 1807. He held it until 1813. He came back under Louis Napoleon's Second Empire and died in 1860. The sisters held crowns too. Eliza Bonaparte was made Grand Duchess of Tuscany in 1809, ruling from Florence on Napoleon's behalf. She lost her throne in 1814. She died in 1820. Caroline Bonaparte married Joachim Murat, one of Napoleon's boldest cavalry commanders. She pushed Napoleon to give Murat a kingdom. He did. Murat became King of Naples in 1808. After Waterloo, Murat tried to rally Italy against the Austrians. He failed spectacularly. He was captured and shot by a firing squad in October 1815. Caroline fled into exile and died in 1839. Pauline Bonaparte, the youngest, was probably the most famous of them all. Famously beautiful, famously extravagant, famously loyal to her brother, but not at all politically important. She appeared briefly on Elba. She died in 1825, leaving behind debts scattered across 4 countries. By 1815, almost all of the immediate Bonaparte family had lost a throne. 5 thrones, gone in the space of a few years. The family that had controlled most of continental Europe was now scattered across the continent, in exile, depending on the goodwill of the very monarchies that Napoleon had tried to destroy. The fall was complete. Now let me get to the women, because the women held the family together in the strangest, most unexpected ways. First, Letizia Ramolino, Napoleon's mother. She was born in Corsica in 1750. She survived the revolution, the rise of her son, the fall of her son, the death of her son, the rise of her grandson, and the fall of her grandson. She died in 1836, at the age of 86. Napoleon called her Madame Mère. She disliked so much of what her son had done that she occasionally accepted gifts from the restored Bourbons. She was, by all serious accounts, the steel of that family. She outlived Napoleon by 15 years. The second woman to track is Hortense de Beauharnais. She was the daughter of Napoleon's first wife, Josephine, by her first husband. Napoleon adopted her legally and treated her like his own daughter. He married her off to his brother Louis in 1802. The marriage was not happy. Their third son, born on April 20th, 1808, was Louis Napoleon, who would become Emperor Napoleon III. After Louis abdicated, Hortense went into exile. She moved around Europe. She raised her sons in a strange patchwork of exile, sometimes in Switzerland, sometimes in Italy, sometimes in Germany, under various names. She died in 1837. The third woman is Marie Louise of Austria, Napoleon's second wife and the mother of the King of Rome. After Napoleon fell, she returned to her father's court at age 23. She had been, in her own quiet way, a hostage of the Napoleonic alliance. Her father, the Emperor of Austria, married her off quickly by proxy to Count Adam Albert von Neipperg. She had 2 more children. She became a quiet Austrian noblewoman who lived until 1847 shows. She was the only one of Napoleon's wives who reached any kind of stable, peaceful life after the fall. Josephine herself had been divorced in 1809 on Napoleon's orders because she had not borne him a son. She had retreated to her estate at Malmaison, west of Paris, where she was famous for her gardens and her rose breeding. Napoleon visited her briefly at Malmaison after his first abdication in 1814. She died at Malmaison just weeks after that visit, on May 29, 1814. She was 50. Her family line, the Beauharnais, continued through her son Eugene, who had been made Duke of Leuchtenberg and had married into the Bavarian royal family. The Beauharnais line continued separately, almost peacefully, while the legitimate Bonaparte line clung to the possibility of restoration. Now let me take you to the second Bonaparte emperor. His name was Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, known to most people simply as Louis Napoleon. He was the nephew of Napoleon I, the son of Louis Bonaparte and Hortense. He was born in Paris in 1808. He grew up in exile. He never knew his uncle personally. He had been raised to believe in one thing almost religiously. He believed in the Bonapartist mission. He believed that he was destined to return his family to power. He became a writer and an activist early on. He published political pamphlets. He tried to organize Bonapartist networks across Europe. He attempted 2 coups. The first, in 1836 in Strasbourg, was a fiasco. He was arrested and deported to the United States. The second, in Boulogne in 1840, was even worse. He was arrested, he was put on trial, he was sentenced to life imprisonment inside the fortress of Ham in northern France. He spent 6 years inside the fortress. He escaped in 1846, dressed as a workman. Then, almost out of nowhere, things changed. The July monarchy of King Louis Philippe collapsed in 1848. France got a second republic. A year later, in December 1848, Louis Napoleon ran for president of the new republic. He won, by a landslide. 4.5 million votes out of about 7.5 million cast, mostly because he was the only candidate with a famous name. He was now the elected president of France, but his term was limited to 4 years, and he knew the Constitution could not be easily amended to allow him to run for a second term. So, on December 2, 1851, exactly 52 years after the date of his uncle's famous coup of 18 Brumaire, Louis Napoleon staged a second coup, dissolved the National Assembly, declared universal male suffrage, and called for a popular vote to confirm his new powers. The voters ratified it. On December 2, 1852, 1 year after the coup, Louis Napoleon was proclaimed Emperor of the French, taking the throne named Napoleon III. France had a Bonaparte emperor again, almost 40 years after Waterloo. The Second Empire is one of the strangest chapters in modern French history. Paris was rebuilt. Baron Haussmann carved broad boulevards through the medieval heart of the city. Industry boomed. Railways expanded across the country. The first department stores appeared. Then came the catastrophe. In 1870, Otto von Bismarck engineered a war with France. The French declared war on Prussia on July 19, 1870. Within 6 weeks, by September 1, 1870, the French main army had been defeated and captured at Sedan. Napoleon III himself was captured on that day. He was 58 years old. He had led France to a far more embarrassing defeat than Waterloo itself. The Second Empire collapsed in 4 days. Napoleon III, his wife Eugénie, and their son, the Prince Imperial, were released from captivity and went into exile in England at Camden Place, in Chislehurst, Kent. The emperor's health, never good, worsened. He died in 1873 at 64. His son joined the British Army, served in the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, and was killed in June 1879 in a skirmish with a small group of Zulu warriors. He was 23 years old. With his death, the direct line of Napoleon I was effectively over. Now let me talk about the property, because that's where this story gets really strange. When Napoleon fell, his empire had been one of the most expensive in human history. He had built enormous palaces, filled them with art he had either commissioned, bought, or simply seized from the royal houses he had overthrown. He had his crown jewels. He had the famous Regent diamond, the third largest diamond in the world. He had the sword of Charlemagne he had taken from Aachen during his coronation as King of Italy in 1805. He had paintings by Rubens, Raphael, Titian, Rembrandt. He had the contents of the Vatican pavilion that had been shipped to Paris. He had parts of the famous Ghent altarpiece. When he fell the first time in 1814, the coalition insisted he return many of these seized items. The French managed to keep most of them through a series of complicated legal arguments. When he fell the second time and the Bourbons came back for good, the official policy of the French state was that everything the previous French kings had owned before 1789 belonged to France, so the Louvre kept most of what Napoleon had taken. Many items he had personally owned stayed in his personal estate and were eventually sold off in a series of grand sales from 1817 to 1820, went to the royal family, sold to private buyers, or simply disappeared. Now here's the forgotten part. Napoleon had been enormously rich. He had personal properties in France, in Italy, in Switzerland. He had his palaces, including Malmaison, Saint-Cloud, Fontainebleau, the Tuileries, the Grand Trianon. He had farms, vineyards, real estate in Paris itself, art, jewelry, gold, silver, and one of the most important private libraries in 19th century Europe, much of it assembled by confiscation and through the spoils of his campaigns. When the Bourbons returned, much of this was confiscated by the state, and here's where this story starts to feel strangely contemporary. The legal claims have continued for almost 200 years. Several of Napoleon's descendants have made legal claims against the French state for the return of art and furniture. In 2019, Jean-Christophe Napoleon, the current head of the Imperial House of France, was reported in informal discussions with French cultural officials about the possible return of items associated with the Saint Helena medal. The French state maintains its position. The Bonapartes maintain theirs. A small round table, reportedly from the Salon des Glaces at Versailles, was sold at a private auction in 2023. The French Culture Ministry intervened, but the table had already left French territory. The case is still pending. And the sword Napoleon wore at Austerlitz, his favorite, was reported missing for over a century, until a museum acquisition in 2024 turned up a near match in a private collection. The chain of custody is still being pieced together. Let me bring you into the 20th century, because the family didn't vanish, even after the Second Empire. The line of Jérôme, the youngest of Napoleon's brothers, had become the senior line of the Bonapartes. Jérôme's son, Jérôme Napoleon Charles Bonaparte, was born in 1830, was at the coronation of Napoleon III, and watched the fall of the regime in 1870. His son Victor Napoleon, born in 1862, was a complicated, hot-headed figure who ended up in exile for life. He died in 1926. Victor's son Louis Napoleon, born in 1914, came back to France in 1950. His son Charles Napoleon, born in 1950, is widely considered to be the head of the Imperial House of France in the Bonapartist line. His own son, Jean-Christophe Napoleon, born in 1986, has become the visible face of the modern family. He married in a kind of royal-style ceremony in 2019 and has participated in public events that are mostly ceremonial. He has campaigned, somewhat unsuccessfully, for the return of certain imperial-era properties to his family. He has expressed interest in several ongoing legal disputes with the French state over Napoleon-era art holdings. The Bonapartes today, however, are not wealthy in the way European dynastic families have sometimes been known to be. They are, in fact, mostly just private citizens. Some of them run small businesses. Jean-Christophe is reported to have had a stake in a small advertising firm. There is no palace. There is no state-funded endowment. There is no official position. Their titles, precisely because France is now a republic that does not recognize any official royal family lineage, are legally just a surname. There is an important internal family dispute. There is in fact a competing claim to the headship of the Imperial House of France, advanced by Jean-Christophe's older brother, born in 1987, who has, since 2010, claimed to be the rightful head of the family based on the older rules of male line descent. Most historians recognize Jean-Christophe as the senior family member in terms of public visibility. Each year on January 14th, the family commemorates Napoleon's birthday at Les Invalides with a small ceremony. A wreath is laid, speeches are given. It is now essentially a private family tradition, watched by maybe a dozen journalists each year. It is, in its quiet way, the family's last official ritual. Now let me take a step back and put the Bonapartes in wider context, because the Bonapartes aren't unique. Almost every major dynasty that fell in the long 19th century had to deal with something similar. Take the Romanovs. They fell in 1917 in the Russian Revolution. Tsar Nicholas II was executed with his entire family in July 1918. The surviving branches scattered across Europe. Some intermarried into other royal families. Some ended up quietly in the United States. Various Romanov family members have made legal claims for the restitution of Russian imperial art. Most have been rejected by Russian courts, often on technical grounds. They have no throne. They are simply one of the most famous families in modern history. Take the Habsburgs. The Habsburg Empire collapsed in November 1918 in the final days of World War I. Emperor Charles I was exiled to Madeira, where he died in 1922. The Habsburg properties in Austria were confiscated by the new republic. Otto von Habsburg, the eldest son, became head of the House of Habsburg in 1922. He lived in exile for most of his life, mostly in Belgium and Germany. He returned to Austria in the 1960s. He served in the European Parliament for 2 decades, representing Bavaria. He died in 2011. The Habsburg property claims against the Austrian Republic have been mostly settled through legal deals that ran from the 1960s through the early 2000s. Take the Bourbons. The Spanish Bourbons have been in a near-constant state of internal family dispute for nearly 2 centuries. The Spanish branch was exiled in 1931. They have returned to Spain in a kind of semi-ceremonial manner. They no longer rule. The Two Sicilies branch has stayed mostly private. The French Bourbons have had internal disputes about who should be head of the house, sometimes based on different interpretations of the Salic law. The House of Savoy in Italy ruled Italy until 1946, when the monarchy was abolished by referendum. The royal family went into exile. The male members of the family were excluded from entering Italy for many decades, until the law was changed in 2002. The disputed headship question among the Savoy descendants has continued quietly, with no visible resolution. Every dynasty that has fallen in the past 2 centuries has had to negotiate this strange, prolonged negotiation between past glory and present reality. The Bonapartes have done it longer, and in many ways more chaotically, than most. And now let me give you the moment more people miss. In 2022, French auctioneers announced the discovery, in a private Belgian collection, of a small but astonishing Imperial Bonaparte item, a small notebook written by Napoleon himself during his last weeks on Elba. It had been missing for nearly 2 centuries. The notebook, written in his own hand, contains some of the most personal reflections he ever produced. It was scheduled for sale. The French state intervened. The Belgian government intervened. The Bonaparte family made a quiet claim under Belgian inheritance law. The case went on. And as of 2026, the notebook still hangs in legal limbo. The notebook is small, but the symbol of it is enormous. It is the kind of artifact that confirms, in ways documentaries don't, that the Bonapartes have been negotiating the fall of their empire, in one form or another, for over 200 years. And the negotiation hasn't ended yet. So here's what we know. Looking back at the whole strange tale, Napoleon didn't just lose at Waterloo. He lost a dynasty. Paris lost an empire. His wife lost her husband twice. His son lost his father twice, and died in exile, buried in a Habsburg crypt. His brothers lost 5 thrones. His sisters lost 3. His mother outlived almost all of them. The emperor's body was made the centerpiece of a national monument in Paris, while his son's body was left in Vienna inside a vault he never asked to enter. The family survived. It adapted. It stayed mostly quiet. It kept its titles, even when those titles meant nothing in law, and it kept making legal claims for art, for property, for the return of Napoleon's memory. 200 years later, they are still at it. And that is probably the most human part of the whole story. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It really does help this channel keep telling these kinds of stories. I'll see you in the next one.